So hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar this afternoon on complying with HE accessibility regulations in month one. My name is Mark Gaddis. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at AbilityNet, and I'm joined by Abi James, also of AbilityNet, and Alistair McNaught of McNaught Consultancy, who are very kindly waving to identify themselves on the screen. Next slide, Abi. So just a bit of information about what we're going to be talking about today. So this webinar, just to remind you, provides an update on how public sector bodies' accessibility regulations are being implemented by universities and other higher education institutions. Just a few bits of housekeeping. So live captions are on during the webinar. This is provided by a company called MyClearText, and it is a live person running that. So we appreciate MyClearText support. Slides, a transcript and a recording will be made available of this webinar. So if you're having technical issues, if you need to leave early, don't worry, there will be an automatic email that goes around sharing the recording and slides post-webinar. Depending on how you've joined the webinar, there's two features we want to draw your attention to. So there is a chat window and a Q&A window. We want to keep the chat for more general conversation, so perhaps you have a comment that you want to make about a specific slide or want to chat to other people that are in attendance, please use the chat window for that, because there is also a Q&A window, and that is to ask questions specifically to the panelists. So at the end of this session, we will have Q&A, and if you want to ask Abi or Alistair anything, please do drop those questions into the Q&A at any point during the webinar. And then last thing, just to say on this kind of welcome slide, is just that there is a feedback form post-webinar. It does ask you to rate the webinar. It asks you to tell us anything, any comments or feedback. And it also invites you to tell us about any future topics you'd like us to cover. So if there is something particular that you'd like to see us speak about in future webinars, please do use that as an opportunity, because we do look at those responses. Next slide. So yes, just before we kind of get stuck into the actual content of this webinar, just a bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about. So we're going to start off with hierarchies of statements. So if you have multiple websites or apps, thinking about accessibility statements, which we know is very important, and thinking about the hierarchy of those statements. We're going to share support available, so tools and resources available that can help you relating to the new UK public sector bodies' accessibility regulations for higher education institutions and public sector. We're going to talk about developing an accessibility roadmap, so plotting activity and thinking about your intent with regards to accessibility at your institution. And then lastly, before the Q&A, thinking about what students will expect and how this can shape your responses with regard to the roadmap. So now what we're going to do, just before we go on to the content, is we are going to do a quick poll. So depending on how you've joined this webinar, you'll see this come up on your screen. So if I can just ask for the next slide, Abi.
Yeah, Mark, can I just say a few people have said they have had problems with the audio. If there is anybody, I think some of you can hear us. So
yeah.
But if you are getting specific issues, please, we'll just try and keep an eye on the chat pane and pick them up. Great.
Yeah. Might be individuals. I'll pick that up in a second with anyone that's continuing to have issues. But yeah, we're gonna do a quick poll just to test the technology, to get you interacting with us. Depending on how you joined the webinar. So if you're joining via a phone, you won't necessarily see this on screen, but you can use the chat function to answer as well. And the first poll is just to get a sense of. Oh, sorry, I'm going to end that. The first poll is just about confidence about accessibility, your current accessibility statement with regards to the new accessibility regulations. So how confident are you that your current accessibility statement meets the new accessibility regulations? And I'm just going to give people a chance to respond. At the moment, about 57% of you have voted. Last few seconds for anyone that can see the poll on screen and wants to engage with us. And I'm going to end the poll now. And I'm going to share the results. So how confident are you that your current accessibility statement meets the new UK accessibility regulations? The majority of you say you're somewhat confident. That's 46% of the people that are in attendance. But there is also a high number of you that aren't confident, and that's 24%. That's the next highest percentage. And then obviously below that, 9%, 5%. We've also got 15% that are saying it's not necessarily relevant to them. Obviously appreciate that question was more targeted towards higher education institutions. But I do think that a lot of the content we'll go through, you'll find relevant. And obviously I hope that is useful for Abi and Alistair, just in terms of shaping the content and what we might want to focus on going forward. So I'm now going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Alistair for the next portion of the presentation.
Thank you very much. And we have pyramids, because one of the things that I think will become clear in the next few minutes is that having a single accessibility statement to cover an entire website is possible. It's possible depending on the size of your website. But once you then move into education and you talk about a single accessibility statement for your entire virtual learning environment, then it becomes much, much more difficult. So I want to unpack some of the principles. So that's the next slide. Because how you make accessibility statements meaningful depends on some guiding principles. Now, if you get the guiding principles right, you will get the kind of compliance element right as well, and a lot more besides. So if we start off then, the first guiding principle, being user-focused and practical, and I'll unpack what these mean in more detail in the next few slides. Second element, being contextually accurate. Third element is being active, proactive in proclaiming the benefits of accessibility. What's the point of investing enormous amounts of money on making really accessible content if the student still doesn't benefit because they don't know how to use it? So that's a really important principle. Next one is flagging potential barriers and workarounds, and that's absolutely embedded in the government model statement. And the next one, providing contacts if further help is needed, and again, that's something that is completely embedded in the in the requirements, the core requirements. So if we unpack each of those, the next slide, the user focused and practical, the guiding principle of this principle is who is my audience. And so here are some examples. If I get Abi to look at these, what level of technical detail is appropriate? Are you going to talk a lot about, which WCAG checkpoints you meet fully and which ones you don't meet fully, to a student that hasn't got a clue what you're talking about? The key things are to tell them things that might help their digital competence. Tell them things that are in a way that they think, oh, I hadn't thought of doing that before. What will give them a better experience of the content? And how do you tell them in an accessible way? Because if you have just a really great detailed accessibility statement, but it runs to 15 pages of dense typed text, that's hardly accessible. So you need to think about length, layout, the appropriate medium. I kind of can see an evolution of some accessibility statements being multimedia, having video embedded and so on. And how easy is it to get to for a disabled user? Most accessibility statements are the 110th or so link on the page. So right down in the footer. That's not necessarily helpful. So the next principle, the next overarching principle, is being contextually accurate. And that's where you really begin to understand the sense that there needs to be a hierarchy, because the guiding principle is what I need to know as a student. So if we look at this, the first thing is to avoid cognitive overload. So if you only have one VLE accessibility statement and it tells you on, about this bit of this course and that bit of that course, and I'm only doing one of those courses, I don't care about your inaccessible Java applets in physics if I'm studying law. So don't tell me what I don't need to know. So that doesn't really belong in an overarching statement. That belongs in a smaller statement, sort of lower down. Being easier to find also, because if you have these contextualized course level accessibility summaries, then that could be flagged in line 12 of a physics accessibility statement. There may only be 15 lines in that physics course accessibility statement, and line 12 tells you about the Java applets, rather than being 412, line 412 of this giant VLE mega statement. And it's more accurate because a web manager trying to do a statement for the entire VLE hasn't got a clue about your Java applets or that you even use them in physics. So you get more accuracy when the staff delivering have some responsibility for saying what works and what doesn't. And then I think, what's the last one on there? Yes, the accountability, because it means that if you have a course level statement, even if it is only 12 or 15 lines about this works, this doesn't, there's an accountability, because if there is an issue because of content that I as a tutor uploaded, then they know to come to me. So it's, it becomes very humanized. Let Emily or Omar know so that we can discuss the issues. So the next one, we need to be very clear on proclaiming the benefits of accessibility. That's so important. The guiding principle here is for you to get a return on the investments you've made. So starting through these, we've got things like what can be done. Having made this accessible content, you can do this, do magnification and reflow. You can navigate more effectively using simple tools, navigation tools like headings map in a browser, for example. You can use text to speech, you can change colors. Tell people, because most people won't have a clue that they could even do that. Do your video transcripts have captions and summaries, etc.? Does your document navigation allow you to kind of instantly find any heading within that document, allow you to personalize that document, etc.? So these are all the sorts of things that make a big difference to students simply by telling them how they benefit from what you've done. And then the next slide, the next principle is flagging the barriers and the workarounds. And this is where we get into the nitty-gritty compliant bit that is the legal element that has to be ticked. And the guiding principle here is to save people time and frustration. There isn't an expectation from our conversations with GDS that everybody will be miraculously 100% compliant from the go. There is an expectation, though, that where you have areas that are not compliant, you at least have the courtesy of telling disabled users that they're going to experience a problem there, and here is an alternative solution for them, rather than them wasting time trying to do something that actually you should have known straight away wouldn't work anyway. So that guiding principle is a really critical one. Save people time and frustration. So that has an implication that you, as an organization, at whatever level you're talking about, as an e-learning manager, as a course tutor, you need to have enough accessibility knowledge to know what sort of things are likely to be a barrier, to know your PDFs don't work, to know that your Word documents haven't got a heading structure, to know that you haven't actually checked whether your Java applets work or not. So you need to find out. You can tell people what is definitely an issue, and that's often relatively straightforward. So here's a couple of examples. Lecture capture videos, you've only got automated captioning, okay? So they're only about maybe 60 to 70% accurate. If people know that, that means they don't necessarily make massive misunderstandings by hearing a misinterpretation and writing it down in their exam answer because they got completely the wrong end of the stick because of a misinterpretation on the automatic captioning. If people know that, they can work around it. They can be guided to, if you've got a problem, then go and talk to your tutor. Or if this doesn't seem right, recognize that the captions may be dodgy, so go back to the lecture notes. And also who you can contact. So there will be barriers. There will always be potential barriers. The issue is that you know what those potential barriers are and that you know how you will anticipate getting around them. As well as the definite issues, there might be issues. And so in many courses that I've audited, there are 30, 40 PDFs. Some of them are really good. Some of them are really poor. I won't necessarily be able to tell you exactly which one is which at this stage of the compliance timeline. But what I could do is say that I know there's a bit of an issue. So if you find a problem, contact me, and so on. Librarians can be brilliant at helping on this because they can tell you in terms of journals and ebook platforms, they should be able to say to you, okay, anything from that provider will be pretty good. From that provider, it might not be so good. So people can then begin to anticipate which things they prioritize in reading lists, for example. And then the other thing that you could do is you could say, focus in on the kinds of things people might need. So if color contrast helps you and you're reading ebooks, then try loading it into download the PDF chapter, load it into Adobe Reader, because that's the surest way of changing colors. If you read the PDF online, you won't be able to change the colors. So it's those sorts of guidance that you can give on things that may be an issue or that people might have particular preferences for. So the next slide is support available. So I'm just going to kick this off and then Abby's going to continue. So the next slide here is go back to the source, because most of you will be using perhaps Microsoft products or Google products. There's loads of really good accessibility built into those if you know where to find it. So make sure you know and make sure your students know. And the next slide is borrow from others. Now, I won't go through all of this now because you can look at the slide later on your own, but there are here's a sub-sample of a resource, a crowdsourced spreadsheet that we've got, but I picked out different examples of different universities doing great stuff in terms of guidance for staff, guidance for students. Don't be afraid to borrow from others. Don't be proud, but be collaborative. So that's over to Abby now, I think.
Thank you. Yes, and great to hear how Alistair's been working through all the logic with the accessibility statements. And I wanted to flag one final resource, which is being Alistair and other colleagues within the sector have been putting together on the LexDis website. Now, some of you may have been aware of the LexDis website before. It was originally a project to collate student strategies of how they're using assistive technology. We've now added a digital accessibility section with lots of resources that particularly come out of Kent University and Kent County Council and their toolkit, and we're adding to them all the time. And it gives lots of documentation about how to approach the regulations, how to engage with senior managers, including templates, how to talk to suppliers, how to think about procurement. So this is a really good resource if you have, if you want to push the regulations up through your management to say, actually, what should we be doing? And we've been talking about this again with government digital services, and they're aware of it, and really, checking all the facts are there straight. So if you are thinking, well, actually, how should I be doing this, and where can I start? Please go and have a look at LexDis. You can also use the contribute tab. There's a form there. You can, if you've got anything that you think you would like to share with the community, then please let us know, and we can add to it. And finally, that site is all a Creative Commons site. So there's anything on there, it's an open license. You just need to say where you got it from, but you can adapt it, change it. You've got a different version you think might be useful, please do come back as well. So there's really a way of trying to collate and share information. So I'm now going to move on to a section where we're thinking about a bit sort of further ahead. So we're day 4 of the regulations really coming into effect. It's been a bit of a roller coaster few weeks with lots of presentations and discussions and getting people engaging with the regulations. We've seen that the government have been doing quite a lot of press releases and Twitter campaigns, getting the public sector to engage. So hopefully you're finding that people are aware of them within your organisation and hopefully in the wider public sector community. But this has been about, okay, new websites now need to have accessibility statements and need to be compliant. But where next? What actually are we going to do to make sure that this continues, that as I always talk about the accessibility journey, where are we going to go next? So I think the thing that's important to remember when you're thinking, well, really, do I have to think about that? Is within your accessibility statement, you must indicate how you plan to fix any accessibility issues. So while Alistair highlighted that there's a recognition that very few people can say they're 100% compliant, you do also have to tell people what you're going to do to fix accessibility issues. While there is an option to claim disproportionate burden, to say that it's too much work, not enough return on investment, too difficult technically to address accessibility issues in certain parts, the government monitoring team have indicated to us that they consider that to be essentially time limited. You can't claim that forever. You can't say, well, actually, you know, the system is just so much work, we're never going to do it. If they come back in 3 years' time and see that, they might say, well, you've had 3 years to do that, to get the resources to plan and build that in. If it's a new version of a website, you should have thought about accessibility. So we need to think about that as a time-limited exemption. And also, accessibility statement must be reviewed at least once a year. So if you make any significant changes, you've got to review it, and you have to review it at least once a year. So that means you need an accessibility plan. And actually, in the government model statement, they actually include a section saying what we're doing to improve accessibility. Again, this is great for transparency. It's great for people to acknowledge that they are on a journey, that they are going to improve, but actually, how do we go about that? So one key way to do that is to actually roadmap, to actually say what at a high level are our objectives, who do we need to engage with, and I've got a screenshot there from a sort of typical development roadmap, Gantt charting, just sort of outlining. And it's really about the journey of trying to aim for fully compliant. Again, acknowledging technically that can be very challenging if you've got complex, you know, physics, maths content, but actually that's where we should be all aiming for. So that's our overarching objective. But recognizing, although a roadmap tends to be something used in software development or project management, it cannot be just a technical plan. There must be some objectives, and that really relates back to organizational policy. You know, is it that your organization has a policy that all public websites must be fully compliant? The VLE will, you know, in some sort of cycle. You've got to have some objectives, which is obviously going to be tied to sort of your management structure and resources available to guide any type of plan. Got to think about deliverables. Again, it's not just technical. We've already been talking about getting staff who are creating teaching materials involved in writing accessibility statements and making sure their content is accessible. That is going to involve staff training. You might have to reach out to your design teams to make sure that any branding updates take into account accessibility, as well as actual technical development. It also needs controls. So checks before deployment. It's absolutely horrendous when we see that, it's terrifying, something was accessible and then an update gets released and we all go backwards. So how do you check things before deployment? Or even if you've got a content management system, how do you make sure that when people post new content, you can control it as much as possible? But that's all about new content. What about all the existing problems you've identified, older documents that are still in use that need to be remediated? And again, this doesn't stand on its own. You might be thinking, well, I know there's a team over there who are doing some website development, so I need to know what their priorities are and how I can fit accessibility into there. And also dependencies. You have other people who have to engage with this process as well. So here are just some things to think about when developing an accessibility roadmap, when we're working with organisations to help them plan for their accessibility and engage it in a whole organisation strategy. First thing is categorising issues. And that's really about thinking about who deals with it and what type of issue it is. And just on a top level from a university basis, one of the things is obviously content remediation. If you're getting a lot of images without alt text, if you've got PDF documents and PDF files that are coming off, that's a content issue. It's not necessarily your back-end server and your back-end technical issue. You might want to think about separating out third-party content or add-ons as separate, because you're going to have to potentially talk to a third party, your suppliers, about that. What I've called structural issues, that's really, you know, your navigation on your website, your database system that's pushing out, stripping out all your alt text or something like that. So something that's really technical that you're going to have to think about, that once fixed will then resolve many issues across your site. Template issues, that can be particularly related to your branding and your colourful and your fonts, but it might also be related to, do you have a particular PowerPoint or Word document template that you can roll out across your organisation? So templates can be a really quick win if they are accessible. And then my final one there is bugs, because essentially quite a lot of accessibility issues are sort of bugs that creep in, things that were pushed out without being checked. It really is about quality control from an accessibility point of view. So those are different categories that you might want to think about. Every time you have to sort of base it around your own product teams as well and development teams. The other thing is who is responsible, particularly within large universities. There's obviously lots of people involved. So people internally might be responsible for remediation. So, you know, we've got this content on our websites, we know it's not accessible, so we need to go back and fix it. That's an additional task on top of their day-to-day job. How are we going to fit that in? Current projects that are already going along, so if you're already updating your websites, if you are thinking about updating an internal system like HR or expenses or library systems, how do we engage with those current projects? And then future projects. If anybody's starting to think about a digital project, how do you make sure accessibility is there from day one? And then I've separated out suppliers separately, because that's going to be potentially a different group of people who may be engaging on that with accessibility. And it might not just be at an organisational level, but we might be doing procurement through buying consortiums as well. And I was at a meeting earlier this week, presentation, and somebody was saying, how do we get our suppliers to actually take their accessibility responsibility seriously, because it's going to cost us if we start buying it in and having to fix it. And I think we really need to get the procurement people to take accessibility into their planning processes, make sure that the buying consortiums are also understanding how they can help in that and engage with that. But also then think about your current suppliers and service level agreements. Are you making sure that accessibility is being included in their roadmaps as well? But remember, finally, be realistic. This is a very, accessibility is a challenging area. The regulations are setting a very high bar, but as long as we plan and be realistic, we can improve things in the longer term. Prioritise issues, not just on how I've talked about categorising issues, but actually the impact of the accessibility barrier. So that may be on the impact on a specific community, a specific type of need, because it's going to stop screen reader users, or it could be prioritising based on the number of users, how many people use a site or a course. Involve users to understand impact. There's a huge wealth of users within the university sector. Your disabled students, your disabled support services, support staff, your own research teams as well. Many people have experience of understanding the type of difficulties we're trying to remove. Talk to your peers, share best practice, things like webinars like this, Lexis, other events. There's lots of people now developing events. So please do ask the questions and share your best practice as well, because it's about shaping what is good and what is a good practice. And really, I think, you know, one of the key things that we're going to have to think about moving forward in HE and public sector is how we engage the private sector in understanding these regulations and what we expect of them in the future, because otherwise the public sector is taking all the responsibility and the cost for them not actually developing to standards. And then finally, leverage compliance and return on investments, taking all the messages, positive messages Alistair was saying about student experience and the benefits. This is our big stick now, but we've got a carrot as well. If we can do this and build it into our roadmap, it shouldn't be all about, oh, I've had an audit, I've had testing done, and it's all terrible. Let's actually build this into the roadmap. So I think I have enough time just to run another poll, which would be really useful. So what we want to ask is, what are your key accessibility objectives going forward? It's a multiple choice poll, and if there's anything missing off there, then feel free to put it into the chat pane as well. So what we would really like to know is where you are on this journey as your organisation. What are the key objectives that you're looking at for the next 3-6 months as well, and that can help us with just helping you in the community as well. So Mark, you'll have to tell me how many people have run it and decide when to close it. I don't have control.
Yeah, we'll do. We've got 39% of you have voted, so I will just give you just a tiny bit more time. Got 65% of you have voted now, so just a couple more seconds, just in case any of you are mid-completing. I don't want to cut you off. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. It's been up for a minute, and I'm going to share the results. Can you see that on your screen, Abby, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, I can see that as well. So that's really interesting that your key objective is training staff with 66%, but followed quite closely with testing our website at 51% and publishing an accessibility statement at 45%. So it's really good to see that you're taking this both as a technical basis, a compliance basis, and training your staff. That's really good to see. Also, developing an accessibility policy. Good to see that's at 39%. It would be useful that that's sort of one of the key starting points, but I think going forward, accessibility statements, we should be seeing policies, not statements, policies, we should see those taking a much more prominent role and guiding organisational change as well. And I'm just looking here at a few comments. Just coming in, updating teaching resources, making our content accessible, inclusive design, ensuring compliance of our accessibility statement of e-learning courses. So I think lots of people there saying that they can understand the journey and the objectives, and that's really good to see that training particularly is taking such a key point. So I'm now just going to hand back to Alistair for last few points to cover before we go into Q&A for the last part of the session. So Alistair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's been some really interesting discussion early on in the chat about, you know, how realistic is it to look at accessibility statements coming down to course level, and I'm hoping that, you know, these next few slides will kind of help to give some context for that, because I don't think any of us dispute the difficulty there is in getting staff engagement, but staff will not engage in training unless there's a purpose for it and unless there's a clear driver for them. And if they don't have to do anything specifically, if they don't have any responsibility for the accessibility of their practice, they are not necessarily going to change just for the sake of it. So let's have a look at the student angle now. So next slide. Student dilemma up until this Monday was that there was no clarity for them of what they could expect. They had no experience. Very often students have very limited experience of what digital content looks like and how they can use it and personalize it, because they've never seen it, or if they've seen it, nobody's told them what they can do with it. They often have no desire to be a troublemaker. They don't want to be labeled in that way by complaining that this is difficult to use. They often have no energy. I've spoken to so many students, both after their courses are finished or during their courses, where they say, I've got the energy to take them to court, or I've got the energy to complete my degree. I haven't got the energy for both. Very often there's no confidence in declaring a disability or recognizing that the problems you have are not your problems, they're the problems created for you because of other people's practices or lack of effective practice. There's often a lack of willingness to risk grades by complaining, and there's often no opportunity for relevant feedback. That changed on Monday, and the next slide, in fact, the next slide talks, I'll come back to why it changed on Monday in the next slide, but just to say that changed on Monday, and I'll show you how it changed in a minute. But the NUS response to this student kind of lack of knowledge and lack of empowerment is that they are doing a campaign in the summer, and I'm involved, and Abi is going to be kind of contributing to this in terms of helping steer and edit some of our content. But there's a campaign on digital productivity with accessible digital resources. So now the law says that you should be beginning to expect digital resources, certainly for content that's been created in the last year. You should expect accessible digital content. What does that mean to a student? Most students don't know, and so the NUS is taking part in this campaign where we're saying, just very clearly, these are the ways you will be more productive as a student if your content is accessible. And if you find that you can't use these productivity and personalization benefits, you can't access them, then you are entitled to them. So here's how to go back and appropriately talk to your staff about it. So tens of thousands of students may end up knowing why accessible content is good for them, whether they're disabled or not. The next slide is the really critical bit. It's what I call the 60-second vulnerability, because paragraph 12 of the legislation defines for the first time in 24 years since the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, it defines a reasonable adjustment. And it says that if your accessibility requirement is not met, you've made a failure to make a reasonable adjustment. It also says that if somebody has requested information in an accessible format because you said that it's a disproportionate burden to do all these PDFs, but they don't need all of them. They only need these 3 for their course. And you say, I'm sorry, we're not doing that because we've said it's a disproportionate burden. Actually, to not provide a satisfactory response to a request to provide information in an accessible format, independent of Regulation 13.2, in other words, any other kind of derogations you may have made, that is a failure to make a reasonable adjustment. And that means that in 60 seconds, which is how long it would take me or Abi or anybody else involved in this field, or a disabled student that knows what to look for, in 60 seconds, we could tell you whether a particular bit of content was accessible to that student's need, to that access need. And if it isn't, then all of this can potentially kick in. That is what to be worried about. Don't be worried about the government digital services reporting you to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That risk is a very low risk. The real risk is that it is very easy for a disabled student who fails or who is being compromised in their progress as a result of lack of accessibility. Now there is a total clear line of sight, as my colleague, ex-colleague John Kelly would say, a line of sight between what you should be doing and whether it's a reasonable adjustment and what the implications are if it isn't. So on the next slide, I just want to kind of look at actually the really positive thing that comes from this, because the really positive thing, we've just been talking about student productivity. We've been talking about an NUS campaign to tell students how they can become more effective, how they can access resources more comfortably and more ably if they are accessible. So now the flip side of compliance, and this is where I come back to some of those points at the beginning about how do you involve all staff? How do you give all staff an appropriate responsibility? You now have a legal driver and an ethical reason to raise staff digital skills. Make sure that your staff digital training, whether it's for accessibility or not, has got accessibility embedded. Sometimes staff go on this kind of escalator where they go to training, they learn how to do something inaccessibly, and then they have to go to new training later to learn how to do it accessibly because the original trainer didn't know about accessibility. So raise staff digital skills across the board. Compliant accessibility statement also means that you get better return on investment because you are promoting the accessibility benefits of your Google platform and ecosystem, your Microsoft ecosystem, and so on, your ebooks, etc. It's an opportunity for students to improve their skills, their productivity, and potentially their retention and outcomes. And it's an opportunity to actually improve support needs for more complex needs, simply because people are spending less time wasting, firefighting on the low-level support needs. This is positive. I cannot stress enough. And this is why I just want to get hold of principals and vice chancellors and so on and say, this is positive, this is great. It does everything you want to do and it joins it all together. So use it that way. And I think now it's over to Mark again.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. I think that's really nicely timing some of the conversations that are happening in the chat window and that kind of final section that Alistair in particular covered. I actually just wanted to read one of the comment that kind of, sparked a conversation in the chat window, and also that means what Alistair ended with there is so important. So it's from C. Barrett Wild, and they say, please be aspirational. It may be hard work for you and your academics and your organisations, but imagine how harder it is for those of us who are disabled to not be able to access the physical and digital university. So a lovely kind of ending to the main content of this webinar, and a reminder of, all those frustrations that you may be having at the moment. A reminder, to reflect on why you're doing that, and why this legislation exists, and what you're doing. So yeah, thank you, Abi and Alistair. we are going to have a Q&A shortly, so I just want to use this as a prompt to remind people that there is a Q&A panel specifically if you're joining us on a desktop device. So please do put some questions in there. There's also some conversations going on in the chat window. Lovely to see so many of you engaging with each other and agreeing with each other. So I might highlight some of those and get Abi and Alistair to comment. But what we want to do first, and I'll just ask Abi to go on the next slide, is so before we go too much into thinking about the questions and that kind of thing, we just wanted to highlight some of what your next steps might be, so information that you might go on to. And as we've already said, at the end of this webinar, we will share the slide deck, so I'm not going to describe in detail what's on the screen here. But one of the things is just to acknowledge the fact that AbilityNet and McNaught Consultancy have partnered to offer packages and services specifically for further education and higher education institutions. So we can offer you some support and guidance on your accessibility statement, one-to-one specific to your institution, looking at technical accessibility and digital inclusion. So I think, just to mention that and share that around, and we will share these slides, so you'll have the link there. There's the toolkit that Abi and Alistair have referred to, that they've collaborated on with other people. So to highlight that as a resource, and I know that's regularly updated. There's the Digital Accessibility Regulations JISC mail list. So it's a sector-based discussion. They share information, approaches, and it's a great resource if you're not already using that. And there's attending the JISC Accessibility Clinic. So that's an opportunity for broad discussions, information exchange, alongside input from specialists or trailblazers in the sector. So what I will do is I will just drop a few of those links into the chat window for anyone that wants to make a note now, because you want to look immediately after the webinar. But yes, those are some next steps. But I think if we move on to the Q&A, Abi, because I think we've actually got up to a quarter of an hour here, so there's plenty of opportunity. I guess one of the conversations that was happening in the chat window that I wanted to pick up on, and I think I'll address this to you, Abi, is I'll try and find the originator of this question. But somebody's asked, is there ever going to be a university that's going to be fully compliant? Is there ever going to be a university that's going to put their hand up and say, do you know what, we're 100% compliant? Abi, did you want to just make a comment and share?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a recognition, that there is a question, and it's a bit of an academic question of what does fully compliant actually mean. You can say there's these standards. With sites which are general content, so text, images, even videos, and some menus, there's no reason why that shouldn't achieve fully compliance. I think there's recognition where you start to push the boundaries on technology, when there are particular types of interaction, things like carousels, can be any moving content. Those are sort of the things you look at it and think, oh, here we go, which always can cause issues. So we can be aspirational and say, yes, you can be fully compliant. I think what we're recognising, and we know government digital services do, and actually it's really good that it's built in, this partial compliance is there, is that you're balancing potentially quite complex content, videos and captions and audio descriptions, and maybe maths and STEM and complex graphs, versus actually trying to achieve accessibility. So what we don't want to see is content being removed in order to achieve fully compliant badge, versus acknowledging, well, sometimes actually we need to provide an alternative access form, and particularly when we start to talk about learning content, that might have to be produced in a different format anyway for some students in order for them to understand their communication process anyway. So I think for a absolute university front page type content, we should be aiming for fully compliant. Where we start to talk about internal systems, teaching materials, a recognition that we still have to provide reasonable adjustments for students, and that might involve actual different learning techniques and approaches. Likewise, as we start to see software systems moving online, complex interactions, I see things which are replicating full software packages. Technically, that is very challenging to make accessible as well. So,
I think, sorry, Abi, sorry. One of the things that I think is really important to distinguish between is not whether you are fully compliant or not, but whether any lack of compliance is something that is mindful and anticipated and deliberate. Because as Abi says, there are times when actually you might want to make compromises. I gave an example earlier on about these interactive Java applets. They can be absolutely fantastic for loads of students with loads of disabilities, you know, ADHD, Asperger's, dyslexia, and so on, just giving them something really tangible to try out their kind of physics understanding on. So they can be fantastic. The last thing I would want is an organization getting rid of all of those because they weren't compliant for screen reader users. What I'd rather do is say, these are fantastic. They're not compliant. We'll mention that in the accessibility statement. But what we do need to do then is think about anybody that couldn't use those. How would we do that? So the reason for not being compliant is more important than whether or not you're compliant, which I think is very much the view that we would take.
That's great. And I'm aware, and there's a comment in the chat window about TechShare Pro, Abi. Is that something specifically that you might be speaking more about at that event?
Yes, and actually that's a really good reminder, Mark, with what I wanted to say about 100% compliant. It's really good to learn from our peers and also from other sectors as well. We have quite a few big organisations, companies who are on this accessibility journey, and TechShare Pro is one of the biggest digital accessibility events in the UK, if not Europe. It's 2 days in November, and we're going to be doing a public sector focused session on the second day, but that's also a really good opportunity to learn from the likes of BBC, Barclays, Google, Apple, about how they are adopting accessibility in both the systems they produce, but also their internal systems and supporting their employees, which are essentially, you know, like HE employees and students. So we can actually learn from them. So be aware, although we're saying public sector are doing these regulations and private sector outside, there are many private organisations who are very much embedded within the accessibility journey and useful to learn from. So I'm sure when we send round the chat pane, if there's any questions we haven't answered, we'll include some information about TechShare Pro as well.
That's great. And we are starting to see more questions coming through. So as Abi said, what we will do is anything that we're not able to answer today, we will do a follow-up blog where we'll answer those questions. So do keep them coming through. We apologise if we don't answer them on the live webinar, but yeah, do make sure that you're continuing to ask questions. There's a few kind of quick questions. I think these will be quick questions, so I might ask those and then maybe go into something that might be more of a discussion. I know that we won't be able to share this on the webinar necessarily, but somebody's asked, is there a definite list or guide to the systems that fall within scope of the legislation?
So if I can just chip in there, I was at a presentation on Monday where a similar question was asked by a central government employee, and somebody from the Cabinet Office was in the audience who confirmed that it is anything within a browser. So whether that is internal or external, the only difference is intranets and extranets are behind a password versus a public-facing site, but this is also to support your own employees as well. So it does cover anything in a browser is a website.
Okay, that's great. And actually, you've answered a follow-up question. So somebody else did ask, is it internal-facing or external? Does everything have to be compliant? So I hope you've already answered that person's question as well. Let me just have a look. Abi, I'm aware that you've actually done some kind of workshop training on this. AbilityNet's actually hosted a series of summer workshops, and so I'm actually familiar with this question. Are we expected to audit the entire site in order to be able to say which areas things were not accessible? So I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on that, just kind of that you covered it in some training.
Yeah, so when we do accessibility audits, sort of recommended best practice is you take a sample of pages. So you identify usually homepage and different templates and high traffic pages, and we normally pick a form and things like that. So you go through a process when testing of scoping what you deem to be the audit scope and then take a sample. So you wouldn't plan to test every single page, but particularly where templates are involved, then we would pick from a variety of templates. I think what Alistair was talking about with the statements is, you know, we can have a testing at a system-wide level, but then you test the specific content aimed at different audiences separately. And particularly in a university context, if you want to check that content is right, you might need content experts there. Particularly if you've got foreign language content, you need to think about, is that correct? Is it being announced correctly as well?
That's great. There's actually quite a few follow-up questions relating to the question I asked about internal versus external. So I'm hoping that that's relevant to a lot of you. So I'm going to ask just for a bit more clarity on that. Somebody's asking, does it cover emails? I suppose that's a really difficult question, because do they access their emails in the browser? So is that a really tricky one?
This, you know, let's get to the discussion. There are some grey areas in these regulations. If even people in central government don't know exactly what they are, you can make emails accessible. They are a document essentially. So you should be considering that any content you send should be accessible to all. You know, simple thing. Don't put it all in an image. Make sure the text is accessible. That means we can zoom it in, zoom it out. You can use it on a mobile much better, not using it bandwidth. So moving towards accessible emails is important. And again, thinking about, is this a large scale mailing that's going to all students and all staff and all potential students, versus a tutor sending an email to 5 students is very different as well. So I couldn't say for definite whether an email was in scope or not.
That's great. We've got a few other questions, but I might leave us to pick that up in the follow-up piece, as I said. I'm just going to scan through a few more. So one that's literally just come in from Jessica. If a third-party supplier can say that they only meet WCAG 2.0, not 2.1, or cannot provide an accessibility statement at all, thoughts about whether we would drop them, or do we make this transparent as one of the barriers? What do yourselves? Maybe Alistair, did you want to pick that one up?
Oh, we have a lot of discussions like this in terms of ebooks, and some of the work I've been doing with ebook suppliers, and it's a tricky one. I think in the end, particularly when you're looking at specific educational content, sometimes you don't have an alternative. If there is only one particular book through one particular publisher or distributor that is suitable for your course, you're not going to not have that on the reading list. So I think there are times where you will have to make an exception, but I think what you need to, what I've always suggested that organizations do, is that they recognize in the licensing discussions, they try to anticipate the kind of extra costs that they might have as a result of a lack of compliance from the supplier, and they factor that into the negotiations on license fee. And so, you know, and then you can, in your accessibility statement for that particular course or that particular content, you would then say that, you know, this is less accessible. If you need help, then, you know, here's your contact and here's your alternative, but you've actually saved yourself some money that can then be put towards that. I think once you have those kinds of conversations with suppliers, where you're not just black and white, yes, no, but it's more shades of grey. Okay, this is going to cost us, so we can't pay you what we were going to pay you. I think that really helps to focus the minds of the suppliers.
That's great. Thanks, Alistair. I think we're going to do one more question, and then we'll probably end this webinar. I've seen a few conversations that are kind of hinting at this, and Alistair, I know you've already commented in the chat about this. So this has all started with one person asking, you know, actually extending this question to the wider audience of attendees about whether within institutions, whether they have a specific person that's focused on digital accessibility, but a question's come in just now saying, does anyone know of an institution where academic staff have been given extra time at the expense of other duties to make content accessible, rather than having it as an additional responsibility? I don't know if either of you has any comments, observations or thoughts about that.
I think this ties in with another question about some of the technical solutions like Blackboard, Ally, or Census Access. I think the issue is that this has been an entitlement for disabled people for 24 years. And the fact that people are panicking now is kind of slightly unfortunate, because it's something that should have been in place for a long time. Given that background, I think you have two options really. One is proper staff development or proper staff time. As you say, it's not the staff's fault necessarily that there's been no quality assurance on this for 24 years. So I think an institution needs to look either at proper investment in staff development or giving staff time to remediate some content that needs it, or they make sure you're aware of the derogations, because there's no point in wasting time on lower priority things that actually aren't required. But the second alternative is look for technical solutions, and the best alternative of all is probably to use a blending of technical solutions, either student self-access, things like Census Access, or global corporate solutions like Blackboard Ally, alongside a policy of upskilling staff, and also creating that culture. I mentioned in one of my text chat responses, accessibility is not hard. The basics for making an accessible document is not hard. It's a darn sight easier than getting the basics for doing references and citations right. And yet that's a professional pride issue for academics. Well, to my mind, and to the mind of disabled students, and to the mind of the law, actually professional pride should now extend to knowing that you can create a resource for students that is not going to be actively excluding a proportion of your users.
That's great. Thanks, Alistair. So I'm looking at the time, and I think we're actually going to end the webinar there. As per the slide that's on screen, when we do end the webinar, there is a feedback form that does come up. So we really do encourage you to engage with us. Let us know any feedback about the webinar itself, and also any comments you have about future topics. If you're rampantly writing a question, including the Q&A, you can still include it in that post feedback survey, and we'll make sure that Alistair and Abi have sight of that. But I just want to thank both Abi and Alistair for presenting. I think it's been really interesting. I know that lots of people are coming to the chat function to say thank you for a great webinar. So thank you, and everyone that's joined us, thank you for taking the time out of your day, and we will be in touch with you shortly with follow-up information. So great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye then. Bye.
Good luck.